Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we're the IB English guys. Today we're going to take our framework for reading a prose fiction passage, and we're going to apply that to a great passage that's from a previous IB exam.
That's fantastic, Mr. Giles. And our preview for today goes as follows. First, we'd like to go over the protocol that we introduced last lesson. Then we are going to go ahead and read through this fantastic passage we have for today. After that, we will apply the mnemonic to the passage and try to break that down. And in the end, we'll finish with a thesis statement or final idea using our annotations.
That's great, Mr. Cohen. So we want to remember that when we read a passage, we want to think of it in terms of reading it in several drafts. So the first draft where we read the passage, we want to take in the big ideas and get an impression of that. Perhaps we don't even have a pen in our hands. The second draft is where we start to take that pen out and we start to think about some of the different aspects of the text, some of the questions we can ask, and some of the bigger ideas in the passage. The third is where we want to really apply that mnemonic and start to highlight and start to annotate the text in much more detail to arrive at a good interpretation.
Great, Mr. Giles. And you spoke about the mnemonic. Let's just quickly remind viewers of the mnemonic that we established last video. And the mnemonic is sea coral always settles near islands.
Excellent.
Explain your mnemonic that you created.
Yeah, you can call it SCASNI or you can call it the sea coral acronym. This is important. The S stands for setting. We want to really think about the time and place of the passage.
Yeah, the C stands for characters. You're thinking about the emotions, the feelings, how the character looks, thinks, etc.
Yeah, A is action. We want to think about the plot and the action and what's actually happening in this passage.
S stands for style, and that's where you're considering the literary craft and the moves that the writer makes in the work.
N is narrative technique or narrative point of view, always important to think about.
Yeah, and once you've done all of those things, then you're ready for the I, which of course is to conclude with some final ideas and what inferences or implications can you pull from the text.
Fantastic. Okay, we've chosen a great literary passage, a prose fiction passage that comes from a previous IB exam, but we've adapted that and we've come up with a guiding question. This particular text is from a passage from a novel called A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. She published that in 2013. And the guiding question is as follows. By what techniques has the author built up the atmosphere and tension in the passage?
Okay, so I'm hearing some key words. I'm hearing that we're looking for narrative technique and we're specifically thinking about atmosphere and tension. Okay, so those are the three things I want to keep in mind as I read through this passage.
That's right. Very
all right,
good.
Let's do it, Giles. Let's read this thing.
Here we go. They'd been distracted ever since the cat had run away, and even more so after they'd learned about Benoit's dog being eaten by wolves. Every time Oliver heard a noise outside, he would stop what he was doing and go to the door, open it, and listen. He listened to the screech of the owls, the howling of the wolves, and even the cawing of the ravens with equal trepidation. "I'm sure he's fine," he said, trying to make himself feel better. "He's such a little guy, just a scrawny morsel. Who would bother to eat him?" But they both knew that the forest was full of predators who would love to eat a little cat for dinner. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer, and when the wind picked up, he went out to search for him. Ruth felt bad. It was her fault for getting angry and scaring Pesto out of the bed and into the night. She wished she'd been able to contain her anger. She wished Oliver hadn't made her mad in the first place.
The rain was starting to fall in earnest, so she went downstairs to throw some wood on the fire and found that the stack was getting low. She put on her raincoat and gumboots, grabbed a headlamp and the firewood sling, and headed out to the woodpile. The wind had really picked up and the cedar limbs were thrashing. Where was he? It wasn't safe to be out in the woods in high winds like this. The trees were groaning and creaking under the gale's assault. For such tall trees, their roots were surprisingly shallow, and the forest floor was soggy from rain. She thought for a moment she should go out and look for him, but then realized that was foolish. She started pulling the split logs from the pile and stacking them up in the leather sling. Just then, she heard a harsh cry from overhead. She looked up. It was the jungle crow, perched on its usual spot on the branch of the cedar. The crow looked down at her, fixed her with a beady eye. "Caw!" it cried, with an urgency that sounded like a warning. She looked behind her at the house. The windows had gone black. The power was out. Suddenly, she felt afraid.
What should I do? The rain beat against her face as she turned back to the crow. "Go," she said. "Please, go and find him." The crow just continued to watch her. Stupid, she thought, talking to a bird. But there was no one else nearby, and somehow just hearing her own voice helped to calm her. The crow stretched its neck and shook its feathers. She heaved the heavy sling filled with firewood onto her shoulder and headed towards the darkened house. "Caw!" cried the crow again. And when she turned back, she saw Oliver emerging from the wind-lashed trees, dripping with rain. Seeing her standing there with the wood, he spread out his arms. His feet and hands were empty. No cat.
Wow, Mr. Giles, that is a really fantastic piece to read. I can really feel the tension. I can really feel the atmosphere. I'm excited to do some thinking here, okay?
That's
Nice, nice crow, by the way, okay? Okay, I'm going to take the S from our acronym, and of course that stands for setting. And Mr. Giles, I can clearly see in line 7, we are in a forest full of predators. And in line 9, the wind has picked up. That is very, very scary for me, and I think that creates a lot of tension in a really concrete and scary atmosphere. And moreover, in line 13, we see the rain has started to fall, and the wind is howling, and just quickly jumping down, the power is out, and I feel like there's a need to get some wood from this natural setting and try to move forward. In line 26, we see the rain beating against her face. It's a terrible storm, and the house is dark. And I just think this is a very ominous setting.
Yeah, it's really rural, and it is quite threatening. Even the choice of the animals with the wolves and ravens.
Yeah,
definitely.
lastly, you said it's a rural setting. That's interesting. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, they're obviously collecting wood. They are out in the forest. There's a lot of natural things outside.
Yeah.
That are quite threatening and scary.
Perfect. Continue, please. Let's move into the character.
Yeah, so we see two characters, Oliver and Ruth. They're living together, and they're a couple of some kind. And we notice that they also have their pet cat Pesto. We can't forget Pesto because he's really the character who gets lost, and they're worried about him. They're distracted and worried about this lost cat. This is very important. We also see that they both have feelings of trepidation and fear. I think what's also very important about these two characters, Ruth and Oliver, is that there's been a previous conflict. We learned that from lines number 11 and 12, where we see that Ruth had gotten angry and she can't contain her anger. So that tells you a little bit about what she's like. She had an outburst.
Yeah, and I'd like to confess something, folks. I didn't catch that the first time I read the passage, so I wasn't really aware. I didn't pick up on the nuanced point that these two characters are arguing and fighting. So I think that's really important. So I think sometimes on assessments we see some critical sentences like that if you don't get, you could be in some trouble.
Yeah, and I think they're both quite fearful. Oliver, decides to actually go out and try to find the cat, while Ruth is really almost paralyzed and talking to the crow to try to get help. And I think those are things we want to think about. And again, looking at action, what's happening in this passage. We know that the cat has run away. We see Oliver going outside and deciding to go look for the cat. We see also the woman, Ruth, berating herself and going to the wood pile to try to get more firewood, talking to the crow. And then Oliver comes back empty-handed. This is the plot of this short passage.
Yeah, and I think that takes us to the style, Mr. Giles. Excuse me. We can really look at some of the craft that Ozeki has put into her work. In lines 4 and 5, we clearly see the auditory imagery that helps create tension in this ominous atmosphere. In line 7, the rhetorical question, obviously the characters are unsure of themselves in this moment. They're questioning themselves. Again, we see more rhetorical questions in line 16 or 17 rather. And then again, more auditory imagery with the trees groaning and creaking under the wind. Again, very ominous, very tense setting.
It's almost like pathetic fallacy where the weather and the setting and the forest have human feelings, right? And I think that's creating that atmosphere. I want to talk about that pathetic fallacy.
For sure, and that kind of takes me to this idea of anthropomorphism, where we have a crow who's taking on human-like characteristics and actually engaging in conversation seemingly with one of our characters. So a really great one. And then, of course, the final syntactical move at the end where we see no cat. That short syntax is really punchy and really brings the narrator or brings the reader to more tension, really.
That's great. Style is so important with prose fiction. I think a lot of times students get caught up in just summarizing the text. We have to think about author choices and craft. And so that S of SCASNI we should not overestimate that. The N in our acronym is that narrative point of view. Very important for this passage. It's an omniscient narrator. We're understanding both the perspective of Oliver but also of Ruth. We have their internal thoughts. We're understanding how both of them think. So it's that third person omniscient narration that we can mention and talk about.
That's great, Mr. Giles. Now let's take all of this information now and see if we can reach some really concrete ideas and arrive at some powerful thesis that can control a paper. So Giles, start us off. What's the first idea that comes to your mind?
I think about the uncertainty, the fear that just pervades the whole passage, right? The tension and fear in like not knowing where Pesto is, and the sort of uncertainty of where he is. So I think that's really what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, for me, I think about this relationship between Ruth and Oliver and how they're having a serious conflict right now. And sometimes when we have these conflicts or we have these arguments with our partners, sometimes we lose our tempers and we do things that we regret. And I think that whatever has been spoken here has caused the cat to run away, and Ruth's feeling bad about her actions.
That's great. So let's put those two things together, and let's throw up a thesis that we could use for this passage. And this is what we've come up with for a thesis statement. So it reads as follows. We want to try to make sure we're using the wording of the guiding question, thinking about atmosphere and tension, but we're also thinking about the sort of the main idea that we can draw and come up with an argument. So here's what we have. The tense and fearful atmosphere and the uncertainty of the future of a lost cat helps to parallel the dissonance and instability in the relationship between Ruth and Oliver. It's almost as if the future of their relationship depends on finding the cat.
Wow, Giles. I feel like, going through the SCASNI protocol and then arriving at this thesis, I think that really has informed us and really helped us come to a better statement. What are some elements you like about the thesis?
Well, again, thinking about tension and atmosphere, so that's inherent at the beginning of the thesis statement. But I think the idea of dissonance and instability in the relationship, I think Ruth and Oliver are at the center of it. And it's interesting because obviously they're the main characters that we're thinking about.
Yeah, you've taken those key aspects of the question, you've taken a rich idea that shows insight, and you've push them together, and I really think that we have something positive that we could write about.
What about the second sentence of the thesis statement? Why did the writer do that?
Mr. Giles, that's a really good question. First of all, I think that it's a good choice to break the thesis into two sentences. I think had they tried to push that all together, it would have been really unwieldy and they might have sacrificed their grammatical accuracy. But I think it really just shows an extension. I think it shows an implication of the text. That's actually not written in the text, but we're drawing inferences from the evidence that we've been given, and we are allowed to make some assumptions. And I think that's a powerful assumption and a really powerful implication that we've hit there.
Yeah, the writer could have stopped with Oliver and let that be a thesis, but again, it's just the writer's just doing some extended thinking. I see nothing wrong with that personally.
All right, folks. In the end, we hope that this acronym has given you some insight on how to break down an official IB text, something that we've seen before. Next video, come on back. We're going to go over the piece of writing and talk about that response, and we'll tell you what we liked and what we thought the writer could have improved on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll see you next video. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.
Have a good one.